Hello and welcome to Different Class. I'm Nathan Charlton, and with me I have Jonathan White. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello.
So next month, February, we will be having another Different Class on Wednesday, the 24th of February. And our topic will be economic states of emergency. Our text will be by William Scheuermann, a text called The Economic State of Emergency, appropriately enough. And we'll be doing what we normally do at Different Class, which is using that text really just as a springboard to having a wider conversation about the appropriateness and of states of emergency and how they work and interact with particular types of crisis. So Jonathan, could you explain a bit more about the idea of the economic state of emergency, first of all?
Yeah, so I guess an economic state of emergency would be a context in which exceptional executive powers are used to decide economic policy, and not just in the context of war and conflict, but in a wider sense, whether it's to manage certain crises like recessions or depressions. The Great Depression is often an example given here, or whether it's to tackle questions of the distribution of power in the economy, so perhaps challenging workers' movements and workers' rights, or whether it's the imposition of certain types of policy under pressing circumstances. So here one often looks at the neoliberal reform programs imposed in Latin America or Eastern Europe in the 1990s, so-called shock doctrine, as it's sometimes referred to. So the economic state of emergency is essentially this. It's when economic policy is to the fore. It's the same formula in a sense that we have seen in previous sessions with Machiavelli and Manin, in the sense of exceptional measures being introduced in exceptional circumstances. But I guess here with the difference that it's away from a context of warfare, of open, violent conflict. It's in the field of economic policy. And I guess this is interesting insofar as it's a kind of reminder that this same logic of security can seep into these other domains, like economic affairs, where it's precisely by comparing the situation perhaps to a war or to a state of geopolitical instability that governments can try to find a license for a reform program for introducing various types of measures that otherwise they might struggle to. And I guess it's also interesting to look at, because it's a kind of reminder that emergency politics often, I think, does somehow reflect political perspectives, ideologies. It's often pursued for right-wing or indeed left-wing ends, and I think that's something perhaps that comes through quite clearly when one is looking at something like economic policy. What counts as an emergency very much depends on your political perspective and what it is that you want to keep in the status quo, or indeed what you want to change about the status quo.
Okay. So our text itself is by Bill Scheuermann, who, as I understand it, is a scholar of emergency politics. Can you tell us a bit more about him and how this text applies to what we've been looking at in this series of Different Class?
Yeah. So Bill Scheuermann is someone who is on the one hand a political and legal theorist, and on the other hand someone who I think is very much interested in locating political and legal thought in a social and economic context. So he's partly the theorist, partly the almost sociologist, I guess one might say. And I think in terms of our interest for this current session, on the one hand, he is someone interested in Carl Schmitt, one of the most well-known and indeed notorious thinkers and advocates of emergency rule in the 1930s, a German legal theorist who ultimately comes to embrace these forms of politics and to champion them as ways of advancing quite a far right-wing politics. So the text that we're looking at is, on the one hand, interested in Schmittian understandings of emergency and the kind of the questions that they pose, the difficult questions that they pose for liberal democracy. What does reliance on exceptionalism, on emergency politics, imply for liberal democracy under capitalism, and to what extent can one find a way of protecting the law and protecting proceduralism and so on in the face of this kind of executive discretion? I guess these are kind of the classic questions that someone like Carl Schmitt is posing, and Bill Scheuermann is interested in these kind of eternal questions of emergency rule. I think, on the other hand, though, he's an interesting author insofar as he wants to connect these general questions to the contemporary political context and to the changing circumstances of society and economics in the late 20th, early 21st century. So this is a text which I think is also very much about the sociological factors in play. Why is it that capitalism promotes the kind of recourse to exceptional decision-making that one both sees empirically and which people like Schmitt are trying to theorize in an earlier period of time? And here Scheuermann is giving us a kind of a sociological argument, which is about the nature of contemporary capitalism, how, I guess to put it crudely, that contemporary capitalism is fast capitalism. In the age of financial capitalism, it's about things happening very quickly, decisions being taken very quickly, and that this having a kind of knock-on effect for politics and the law. That if you see, on the one hand, the acceleration of socioeconomic affairs, this puts pressure, if you like, on politics and the law to catch up, to accelerate its processes as well, and that this can all too easily mean the concentration of power in executive actors, those who can present themselves as able to act quickly and decisively. So we're looking at a text which is, on the one hand, interested in the theory of emergency politics and continues discussions that we've had then with previous texts, but also tries to apply these to the particular conditions of society and economy at the end of the 20th century and indeed into the 21st.
Okay. So Carl Schmitt's relationship or understanding of modern capitalist liberal democracy is fairly clear. He is diametrically opposed to it. What's Scheuermann? Because Scheuermann's starting point is discussion through Schmitt. What's Scheuermann's relationship to liberal democracy and capitalism?
So I think very generally one can say that Scheuermann is intrigued by the difficult questions that Schmitt poses for liberal democracy, and yet doesn't want to embrace the kind of answers that Schmitt gives to the problem. So the kind of the analytical problem then would be, how does an order like liberal democracy, which is generally dependent on, at least in theory, is dependent on the separation of powers, so that different institutions are responsible for different tasks, so that power is not concentrated in one particular actor. An order, likewise, which is generally meant to be dependent on rules of general application, in other words, rules that are not intended to govern particular situations, but are meant to have a long-term application beyond any particular situation, crisis, and so on. How does an order which is set up in that way and whose political face is about, again, supposedly about debate, deliberation, the legislature, how does an order that is of that kind set up to deal with extreme situations, again, fast-moving situations possibly emerging from late capitalism? So Scheuermann, I think, takes these to be important and probing questions that Schmitt is posing in the 1930s, and ones that we can't really swat away. And yet, of course, for Schmitt, as I said, a notorious thinker of emergency rule, insofar as he ultimately comes to embrace National Socialism and see these as part of the strategies that can be adopted by the Nazis. How does one embrace the difficult analytical questions without ultimately ending up in that type of political orientation? And here I think Scheuermann wants to take a rather different route. He wants to exactly pose the question of how can liberal democracy be rethought under these contemporary conditions of fast capitalism, so that it has anything like a fighting chance of dealing with the problems arising. This is, I think, it's a interesting question when Scheuermann is writing in 2000. It's, of course, in some ways quite prescient, insofar as the 21st century has been a story of succeeding economic crises. 2008, the financial crash, or indeed the Eurozone crisis of the 2010s. It's been a series of, if you like, economic states of emergency. And I think this discussion very nicely anticipates a whole range of questions that have emerged over the course of the last two decades. I think it's also kind of interesting because Scheuermann is unusual insofar as he is quite critical of contemporary capitalism, and yet is also looking for solutions within the framework of liberal democracy. So this is not necessarily someone inviting us to look beyond liberal democracy to socialism or to some type of radical transformation. I think for him, exactly the question is, how can a liberal emphasis on law, procedure, political deliberation, and so on be squared with the challenges that emerge from late capitalism? And so I think this is, finally, is also kind of interesting insofar as it's a reminder that political legal liberalism it's a different thing from economic liberalism. One can be a defender of liberalism in a political sense without necessarily being an enthusiast for economic liberalism, and indeed being quite concerned about where contemporary forms of economic liberalism are taking us. And so when I think it's quite often that economic liberals and neoliberals perhaps almost try to monopolize the concept of liberalism and to sort of bring political and legal liberalism under their wing, as it were. I think what one sees in this text is these are actually two quite different things. And someone like Scheuermann is, I think, a liberal in the political and legal sense, but exactly treats the problem of greater salience today as how to be such in the light of all the problems that economic liberalism has brought to us in recent decades.